Many clusters have large established firms that are present in the cluster, but to have a strong ecosystem, the established firms need to be open and collaborative. They want to collaborate with other firms, and they act as flagships on behalf of the cluster. Maybe they even spin out companies. There should be entrepreneurs and small innovative firms that can fuel the innovation in the cluster and create innovation, collaboration with other companies. Knowledge institutions are important, but they should not just be there. They should also be sharing their knowledge, and it's very important that they are also open and collaborative towards the companies in the cluster. There should be investors, but not just public investors, also private investors investing money, showing that there is actually there's going on some value creation in the cluster. And then we need some service providers that can work with the companies and help develop the companies, their growth patterns. And but what is most important is the network between all these actors. This is really where the value creation takes place, and this is where we have many clusters have cluster organizations, different types of network organizations facilitating this network. But it can also be facilitated by serial entrepreneurs that know their way around, or deal makers, people sitting in different boards, knowing people in established firms, in the knowledge institutions that can connect these different dots. What is also important about this ecosystem is that what we call blockbusters. And it's really successful firms that have been successful in the cluster, but they choose to reinvest back into the ecosystem, acting as mentors, as investors in the cluster. So it's really important that those being successful, they either stay or come back if they have left the cluster. At least they contribute, paying back some of their success. And then, of course, once this type of cluster then starts to get stronger, it will attract money and talent from abroad, and then we have a positive development going on. All clusters have a market, and understanding the cluster ecosystem is also about understanding what is the market and what is the market development going to look like. Now, so in brief, the cluster ecosystem consists of different actors, and they have different roles. And it's really looking into these different actors when we do the ecosystem analysis and interviewing representatives from these different actor types. Now, when we look at the case of the welfare technology ecosystem in the region of southern Denmark, this was the first ecosystem analysis we did, and it came out about half a year ago, and it has contributed to, it has been input to their strategic development since. We conducted somewhere around a bit more than 30 interviews, I think between 30 and 40 interviews with different ecosystem actors. We did 12 months of analysis, dialogue and facilitation with different cluster actors. And we had a number of interviews with actors discussing new strategy for the cluster. And the cluster adapted the findings and took action based upon the analysis. Now, what did we find? I know that some of you have been visiting the welfare tech cluster during the TCI meeting. I'm going to go through the different cluster ecosystem actors and sort of briefly describe the results that we found. Louise, I just want to say that we have Richard Walker trying to listen in, and he has problems, so I don't know if you need to contact him. So if we look at the market, well, this cluster has a very public market. It's the public sector that is the key market for the cluster, and it is hospitals, it's care solutions at home, elderly houses, and this is so it's a very sort of public-oriented market. And the cluster itself has also been developed with a very strong push from the public regional authorities because they are the market. Tracy Scott cannot hear anything either, Louise.
Yeah,
so,
I'll call him.
Yeah. So it's a very sort of public-oriented market, and therefore we also see very involved public organizations offering test beds and test facilities for the cluster and the cluster companies. So it's a very involved public sector with high interest in developing this cluster. But having the public sector being so active or as a market, it's not necessarily just a benefit. There are it's very difficult for companies accessing the market, the public market, and often also the market is very small. So taking small regional solutions provided to an hospital or a certain municipality, taking that into a global context can be quite a challenge for the companies. So this is sort of what the market kind of looked like in this cluster. Then when we looked at the established firms, well, we asked ourselves, are there any established firms in the cluster? Well, there are some, and a few of them just got more or less active within sort of the last year. We met and interviewed companies like Philips, Falck, Medisat, Linac, which are sort of the cluster's bigger companies. Especially Philips is an interesting firm that is now looking into the welfare tech market as a way of using their technology and sort of sidestepping their technology, using it in new areas. So there are not that many large companies, and when I list them here, it's more or less because they have become active sort of within the last year and a half. But in the cluster's history, there have not been that many large companies in the cluster, partly because the welfare technology business is relatively new. So a lot of these large companies have been working with other things before and then sidestepping into the cluster. And the big companies that are present in the cluster are not particularly active in the cluster development, so they don't act as flagship, they don't necessarily collaborate with other companies in the cluster. Some of them do, and they do to a larger extent, because there is a growing interest in open innovation among these large firms. But they also need to find their way in. They don't want to be seen as pushy. They want to be invited in because they are big companies. They don't want to be seen as being dominating other companies. So they want to be invited in, and this is also what is going on right now. Invited into activities could be, for instance, Philips holding or arranging an Philips Open Day, where they open up some of their challenges, they discuss them with other companies, and they maybe look for solutions in collaboration with others. So they sort of invite other companies in. And this is what is sort of more or less taking place slowly, which is quite interesting. But they need to be invited in to contribute to cluster development. When we look at the entrepreneurs and the small innovative firms, there are not really that many in the cluster. There are very few examples of successful entrepreneurs. Well, partly because it's a business area with heavy regulation, and the market is difficult to enter. But there is a need among the cluster participants and actors to see entrepreneurs really become successful and develop global solutions. So that is really that's sort of the focus right now, creating entrepreneurs or helping develop entrepreneurs in collaboration with the larger firms that can actually sort of create solutions that have global potential. there have been some entrepreneurs that have been successful, but there have been a few blockbusters that do reinvest back into the cluster, but they are not particularly active, or they are not particularly visible in the cluster. So there's a lot of focus right now on creating a stronger base of growth entrepreneurs in the cluster. Now, when we look at the knowledge institutions, there's a very strong knowledge base and research in the cluster. The SDU, the South Danish University, is actually very specialized in this area, and it's located right in the center of the cluster in Odense. It's specialized in robotics, in aging, in rehabilitation, active living, all sort of the different areas that are relevant for cluster firms. But as I think with many universities, but particularly also in this cluster, the knowledge is far from known and used among the companies in the cluster. We had an interview with Philips, a large company coming to the cluster, and the reason why that they did not come to the cluster because of this knowledge that is actually very specialized. They didn't even know about the specialized knowledge that was available there. There's sort of a need to get those, to get the research and the knowledge play a bigger role in the cluster. Then we interviewed investors and looked at what were their role in the cluster, and well, basically, it's the cluster does attract relatively high shares of investment compared to other clusters in Denmark in similar areas. But the large majority of this investment is public money, which is basically partly to do with the fact that the market, the demand is public. But there is a need to attract more private investors, because that will also sort of, once the cluster starts to create more successful growth firms, more private investors will also see the benefit of investing in the area. So that's sort of also the focus on developing that. Well, then we looked at the service providers. There are many service providers in the clusters. Service providers that offer facilities, test facilities, different sort of technology knowledge, technological knowledge in the area. There are many public service providers. But the problem with the challenge that we saw was that they often were fighting over the same few firms. So basically, the number of firms there did not sort of reflect the number of service providers. There were quite a high number of service providers relatively compared to the number of companies, one could say. And the high number of service providers, they also had sort of different objectives. So we saw that there was a need to streamline these of their objectives and have them collaborate more rather than compete amongst each other. Now, in the ecosystem model, it's very important not that we have just the different actors available or located in the cluster. It's very important that they collaborate as well. So we looked into sort of the network and the collaboration in the cluster, and a very large number of network organizations and facilitators are present in the cluster, as I said before. But they do compete and not always collaborate. And then we come down to sort of the cluster organization. The cluster organization, welfare tech. Well, what we sort of pointed out was that they need to step up and sort of get all these organizations and facilitators, service providers, all the different sort of network organizations together, gather them around sort of a common strategy, cluster strategy, and not just the facilitators, also get involved the companies, and this is something that the cluster organization should do much more than compared to what they actually did at that time. And this sort of process is something that the cluster organization has initiated, gathering different organizations in the cluster.
Sorry, Glenda, it's you, Glenda.
Yeah.
Lucia speaks. Can you give us an example of such network organization and facilitators? Because it's a bit, the wording is a bit misleading. Normally, we use the term facilitators for the cluster organization.
Yeah.
And we all have a more or less common understanding. So what kind of organizations or facilitators are we speaking here about?
Yeah, you're right. Normally, the cluster organization maybe would be sort of the only facilitator in the cluster. Well, in this type of cluster, in the welfare tech cluster, you have facilitators that are focusing on developing the cluster from a municipality perspective. For instance, you have organizations that develop the cluster, facilitate collaboration in the cluster, but from the market perspective, that could be the regional organizations working with developing solutions for the hospitals. They go in and take a facilitating role in the cluster, so that because the cluster has this public market, there's a very big interest in developing the cluster. So the public sector has created a lot of facilitators, not just one, but many facilitators, both from the municipalities that want to have a welfare tech solutions developed, but also from the region. So it could, so it's sort of really different types. And then you have, it could also be the companies or sort of public-private companies providing technological support. They also facilitate collaboration between firms. So there are many different facilitators sort of in the market, and they don't collaborate. And I would say now since we have worked with these different clusters, I would say this is one of the clusters where we have seen the most facilitators, and many of them public, because there is this public interest in creating the cluster, because they are the market. The public sector is the market.
Okay.
So the cluster organization really sort of needed to step up and facilitate a development of a cluster strategy involving all these partners, get them around the same table and get them to collaborate, because they were competing rather than collaborating.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
So some reflections, on the model. Why are we using this sort of cluster ecosystem model? Normally, and sort of the traditional way of analyzing clusters is using the LQ, showing what sort of how much does a certain type of employment, how strong is that relatively to other type of employment in the same area, and also compared to other areas, other regions, or other countries. So that's the LQ analysis, and I think some of us, have worked with it already, but it's a very traditional way of working with and analyzing clusters, which is very useful. And the higher the LQ, the more specialized the cluster is. But the LQ analysis leaves us with some gaps, such as we have a strong LQ, we have a high LQ, but is it a strong cluster? Who are the cluster actors, and who are potentially the driving forces in the cluster development? Is there sufficient network and collaboration between the clusters? And what and who is preventing, if any, who is preventing collaboration and cohesion in the cluster? And sort of these type of questions are some of the questions that can be looked into adapting the cluster ecosystem analysis approach, and it can provide some questions, some answers to this. I've sort of listed some sort of methods step by step, and I'm not going to go through them sort of very detailed. It will be available afterwards. But conducting this type of cluster analysis is sort of a long process. As I said before, I think it took us around 12 months with one cluster, starting with identifying the cluster actors and operators, conducting interviews, gathering the information, but also developing policy recommendations to the region based on the analysis, involving the cluster organization and showing them the results and discussing with them how, and is this reflecting their reality, and how could they maybe contribute to developing the cluster based on the findings. But I think that sort of the added value of this type of analysis is that the analysis does provide useful information for the cluster organization and the cluster actors. And it certainly provides information at a level where they even sometimes were surprised about the findings, or they thought, well, I've sort of heard it before, what you present here. Some of it I've heard before, but it's interesting that 10 companies is actually saying it and confirming this, or I thought it was like that, but it's interesting to have 10 companies confirming that that's also their sort of take on it. So it does provide some useful information going into this cluster ecosystem analysis, and also for the policymakers as well. I think what we saw was that the policymakers making and supporting the cluster development, they have done it on sort of a non-fact-based background. Applying this ecosystem analysis offered them a more sort of fact-based evidence that they could base their new policy on. What were the real challenges in the cluster? And so for I would say it really provided useful information. And some of the information, of course, is about it's insights about the cluster dynamics and the cohesions. So who is really collaborating with who, and why are they collaborating? Why are they not collaborating? And sometimes it really comes down to things that very often it comes down to things that can actually be solved. Those barriers that are preventing cluster collaboration. I would say part of what this cluster analysis is also training. It's also education, because through the interviews and showing the model to the people that we interviewed, a lot of the cluster actors, they kind of discovered new aspects about their role in the cluster. Oh, right, I need to do this or that, or I could potentially do this, and other people could potentially do that. So there is sort of also a competence building or capacity building aspect to this type of work, which should not be which really had made some great value for the people we interviewed. And then finally, I think it's a very good starting point to use for developing as a cluster strategy in collaboration with involving all the different actors. It's a very good fact-based ground to build a new cluster strategy upon. So conclusion, I would say that combining the LQ and ecosystem analysis is very useful. The LQ it proves that there is a certain specialization going on, and the ecosystem analysis sort of proves or highlights all the dynamics going on between the different actors. And then use this type of analysis as a tool for strategy development in the cluster. It has great value, and I would say I really recommend it. However, it takes time and it takes effort, a lot of effort. But from our experience, I would say the results are equally good and do contribute to cluster development. For further readings, I want to point to our cluster ecosystem website, clusterecosystem.com. We're going to put all the different cluster ecosystem analysis that we've done, the 4 I've mentioned, and we are going to put, I think half of them are going to be translated into English, or already are, and they're going to be put up on the website. Now there is time for questions. And I think that what we will do is, if you have a question, please write Q, and then we can see your name, and Louise will unmute you. Yes. So please feel free to write Q if you have a question.
Michaela? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. So thank you for your presentation. I really enjoyed it, listening to your explanation to the ecosystem, and I already saw it that it really works very well in Denmark, and you're always looking for creating win-win situations between the private and the public sector. And I'd be interested to hear some of examples or your most successful tools or instruments you're using to facilitate the collaboration between the companies in your network. Are there some instruments that are quite very successful? And yeah, I would be very interested in that.
Okay. I have to say I'm not representing a cluster organization myself. So the type of recommendations that we put forward was how to take this knowledge and make it work in the cluster. So we would recommend that the cluster organization would facilitate meetings where strategic issues were brought up at the meeting, discussing sort of the cluster strategy. Let me just hear you if this is what you mean.
Exactly. I would be interested in if you're organizing meetings, like one-on-one meetings, if there is a company that comes with an issue, or is it a public institution that comes with an issue, and then the network, the cluster network, is going to look for other project partners that could be in charge of solving this problem or this project issue? Or are you organizing study tours with your cluster members, or do you organize some information events or something like that?
I think the cluster organization Welfare Tech is doing these kind of things that you are listing here. They do different types of cluster tours. They do invite companies in and advise them. And I think maybe we even have someone from the Welfare Tech cluster organization with us. I think what you are with us in this webinar, I think what you listing here of activities is exactly what the cluster organization is doing. We as the Cluster Academy, our focus is really on training the cluster managers. How can they build stronger clusters from a perspective from sort of how can they build stronger ecosystems? The type of meetings that we would recommend is more sort of meetings where Welfare Tech would take half a day, invite people from the market, the public sector, hospitals, regional authorities, where they would invite large companies, some entrepreneurs, some investors, and discussing sort of the cluster and what direction the cluster should move. Discussing some of these challenges that were highlighted in the analysis. This is the sort of the meetings that we would recommend.
Thank you.
Yeah, Richard, one moment. Yes, Richard. Richard, are you there? Not at the moment.
Maybe we should take another one and then have Richard afterwards.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm here. My question is related a bit to this public, to the public money. So if we follow the red line, there's the public money kind of trigger of a cluster or supporting the development of innovation. There's the attempt of collaboration, but I missed a bit the wording or the approach of competitiveness. How do you deal with the danger that there is so much public money? The main driver is the public sector. So the companies are developing these cluster activities, collaboration, innovation, but highly subsidized or supported by public money. How do you ensure that they're sustainable, or this kind of thing is not, let's say, in 10 years' time, always dependent on the public sector? How is this correlation or outlook from this perspective?
Yeah. I mean, just talking about this cluster, the public sector is extremely involved because they are the market. This is not the case in all the clusters, but this is the uniqueness of this cluster. The positive thing is that there's a possibility to create very sort of strong test facilities financed by the public sector, which is actually so unique that there is an international interest in testing, using these test facilities.
Mm-hmm.
I have.
I think Wilbur would like
companies. In the end, the companies need to grow. They need either to grow through more jobs or through increasing the value they create in terms of turnover. How to correlate this with the cluster activities or the concern of the cluster to bring them along this kind of road?
I think it's important to look at the public involvement being two things. The public involvement being as a market and demanding the solutions coming from the cluster, using and demanding solutions, and then the public sector as one that is supporting the cluster organization. And so there's sort of two roles that the public sector is playing in this cluster, not in all clusters in Denmark.
Okay.
And I think that the role that in the cluster organization, I think the cluster organization can maybe answer that. The welfare tech can answer that themselves. But I think the majority of their income is from the private sector.
We would like to do that.
Yeah. Sorry.
That's okay. Can everybody hear us?
Yes.
Yes.
We have about 10 people sitting here. This is the CEO of Welfare Troels Mortensen speaking. So how do you ensure that there's sufficient commercial focus in what you do and that you actually take care of the private sector interests? Well, first, I think you need to make sure that your organization is based on a membership, and the members, that you have a significant proportion of private companies as members. So yes, we are a cluster and we help everybody, but we also have a membership base, and our focus is on private companies and recruiting private companies, because we think that gives us an obligation to actually, we have to deliver something to them in order for them to feel that it's worth the membership fee. So that's sort of more of on a structural basis. And in terms of the way we go about business, we've said our focus is not just to spend public money in interesting, innovative projects. There's only one way that you can actually help the citizens, which is the case, which is what our mandate, to bring new technology to citizens. And that is to make these products commercially available. So our focus is very much to help the private sector be able to deliver solutions to the public sector. And the latest funding that we applied for actually has as a clear objective that should allow us to reach a level where we will become independent of public funding for our day-to-day operations. So basically our membership contributions in combination with specific projects that we lead and where we decide on what should be the focus of these projects together with our members, that should finance us 4 years down the line.
So Lucia, I think about the question is, I think maybe a part of the question is, the part of the answer is, there is really two different roles of the public sector, and what I highlighted that they were very interested in developing the market. That is really unique for this cluster. And the cluster organization itself, as was told, it does receive some funding, but it's really smaller and smaller funding that they're getting.
But it also comes down to the double mandates of the regions in Denmark. They have two specific tasks. It's to run the hospitals and the health system, and then it's to promote industrial development. So they actually have two legs. Southern Denmark is the only region that sort of realized that early on and had put their feet firmly on the ground doing both. Now you see the other regions tagging along, but it's basically because they have a dual mandate, and they have managed to combine those dual mandates into one clear focus on welfare technology.
Because there's a huge potential out there. That's what. So how to exploit? Because these solutions are developed for the citizens, but they are not just in the region of South Denmark. I guess they are available everywhere on the other regions in Denmark, in the northern countries, worldwide. So how do you tap on this fantastic potential that you have to exploit the solutions developed through the cluster? That was the idea.
Yeah, I think that the cluster should certainly do some development, and we should facilitate development. But really, I think a lot of the work is, we're not inventing new products. It's just as much the adaptation of existing technology, make sure it's being used in the right way, that you build a business case for it, that you have the documentation in place. That's what really drives penetration on the market, that you train and that you collaborate not just with universities to get more innovative solutions, but that you also work closely with colleges that actually train the staff, the nurses, who are the ones who will actually be implementing the solutions out in the care and the health institutions. So we're certainly focusing less of a focus just on innovation and new solutions, and more on the adaptation of existing solutions, and increasingly on existing solutions, but put together in a continuum of solutions. So we're talking about more complex combined solutions rather than sort of stand-alone devices.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, Mads? Mads? Are you there?
Yes, I'm here right now.
Good.
Good. Hello, everybody. My question is, how could the level of entrepreneurship be increased in the welfare tech cluster?
That's a very good question. There are organizations that are working with the developing the entrepreneurship in the cluster. I think the way that they approach this is in different ways. One way is to create a stronger access point, entry point into the market, so making the access to hospitals more visible, more accessible for entrepreneurs. Really opening the hospitals up for sort of more innovative culture and thinking, so they can have entrepreneurs somehow entering the hospitals and finding out what is needed, and so it's really changing the way that hospitals are working so that they can actually become a bigger market for innovation, because that's what the entrepreneurs will provide them. And then I think another part of it, what they are doing is that they have created a sort of a growth program where they have gathered a handful of sort of promising entrepreneurs, and they've gathered some mentors and some investors, and they try to sort of strengthen the companies in different ways. But it's also, I think, a third point is also the fact that they Philips, for instance, has expressed an interest in sort of collaborating more with the local entrepreneurs. I think I mentioned that they were interested in having sort of an open day, Philips Open Day, something like that. So they sort of open up their company, and they highlight what are their challenges and what are their needs in the area of innovation, and how can and sort of invite entrepreneurs from the cluster in to help them develop some solutions.
Yeah. Should we take the next? Lars? Lars, are you there?
Sorry, I just had to enable the sound as well on my own machine. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, good. Hi, Glenda. The question I have is more on the analysis tool itself. You were talking about how LQ shows concentration as a usual brand, and the way I understand it, the ecosystem provides a mapping of the actors going beyond the LQ and also of their perceived roles and activities. But I would like to hear your thoughts. I mean, from the perspective of a cluster manager working on from a practical perspective, one of the things that I look for, and it might not be missing, but I would like to hear your thoughts on this. What is really important is also the density and the nature of the relationships between the actors in the cluster. So what characterizes the different types of relationships that they have with each other? Are they commercial, competitive, collaborative, for instance? I mean, that's a big difference where the welfare tech region might be characterized as more collaborative in terms of the companies. What dependencies are between them, which transactions occur, what is the level of trust, and so on. So my thoughts on it was that I think you mapped the ecosystem well, but what I'm looking for is more about the relationships, the density and the nature of the relationships between them. Any thoughts on that?
Yes, I mean, and I think generally I would say that the network and the density of the network is really sort of the key to understanding the ecosystem, because we can have all the different actors in place in an ecosystem, but if the density is not very strong, if they don't collaborate, there's not a very strong network, then it is not necessarily a strong cluster, even if the LQ is high. And the different players are there, but they don't collaborate. So the density of the network is very, very important. I would say, from a sort of a method point of view, the problem and the challenge with that is that it's very difficult to measure. So it's really sort of based on qualitative interviews rather than quantitative data. In some previous work, we've tried to work with the to really make some data showing this type of network, and it is possible. That is where we find data for what we call deal makers, those people that are specialized in a sector. Let's say welfare tech deal makers. So it's people that are sitting in different boards. And this is also a way that they do in the US. They map the social capital there is in a cluster, and they do it by measuring the deal makers. People sitting in different boards at the same time, within maybe one person sitting in 5 boards, welfare tech 5 welfare tech companies. He's active in 5 different boards, and that network, when we compare sector-based networks like that, they are in the US, Silicon Valley, they are black because they are all connected and collaborating, and they are very active, but they are sort of gray or very sort of, they are not very strong when we then compare Danish industries looking just into these sort of deal makers. So I think that I fully agree the network itself is extremely important, but it's very difficult to actually capture it just based on interviews. We heard companies saying that yes, they were collaborating. We have got some examples of collaboration, but I think in all clusters, companies, they would say that they collaborate, but then when you look into it, I think the amount of collaboration, the share of collaboration, when it really has to do with innovation, is actually not that strong. Yeah.
May I expand a little bit? Just an add-on, and that's, I would say that's exactly why it's so important to try to address this, to say what is the nature of collaboration, because if it is a very competitive environment in the cluster, then that is one type of situation. Whereas if it's a very collaborative, pointed towards the public sector, for instance, to form partnerships, that is again a very different conception. I understand the difficulty, but I just wanted to highlight in terms of the ecosystem, it's really, in my opinion, the relationships and the nature of those relationships that can shape the way you can act as a cluster manager. So that type of analysis on top of what you're already doing would be very interesting. So that's just a comment.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. And Sabine?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, Sabine.
I have a question in terms of from the practical perspective. How are you doing it? As you mentioned that you have on one hand small companies, private companies, and then the public. How do you do it in terms of billing and organizing to make sure that the services are provided on a long-term basis, but also how does this in practice work between also in terms of billing and organization process?
I think some of the question you had maybe is related to the welfare tech cluster organization,
yes,
more
exactly.
than to the analysis. Is
Yeah.
that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, Troels, are you still online? Because maybe you would like to answer this.
I would like to answer the question, but there was so much background noise, so I couldn't hear anything of the questions.
Could you please ask again the question?
Yeah. So I was wondering how it worked, the collaboration in terms of billing and organizing. That on the one hand you have private companies, small companies, and collaborating with the public sector in terms of health. So how does it work?
Okay, well, that's a clear question. Well, basically, we have a membership fee that you pay every year to be part of welfare tech, and that sort of entitles you to the basic services that we offer. It's differentiated somewhat with regards to the size of the company and the nature of the company, whether it's a private or public sector, small or large. So that's how we differentiate the contributions from our different members.
Mm-hmm.
Does that answer the question? Or?
Yeah, it did. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. Do we have more questions? Yeah. One moment, Ursula.
Yeah. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Do you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Oh, great. So I've got one question just related to the knowledge of the cluster that you were examining. Did the cluster members know about the fact that you were working on the basis of this ecosystem model?
Yes.
Did you tell them? Did you inform them?
Yes.
Did you? Yeah.
Okay, that's a good question. So when we went out to interview the companies, we did explain to them that we were working to understand the cluster ecosystem, and we did bring with us sort of a paper on which we had drawn the ecosystem model, and we could show them that if understanding the ecosystem, cluster ecosystem this way, then we would like to see their role in it. So we did, and that is also what I tried to explain before, that there was sort of an educating role during the interviews. There was sort of an educating role for us to play as well, because we did have discussions on how did they see the ecosystems and what were their roles. So we were sort of very explicit about understanding the ecosystem, and that's what we came to interview them about. I have to say, though, also that sometimes it gets too theoretical, and then it's better just to shut down that sort of type of discussion and then just ask about things that would indicate an ecosystem and indicate their role in the ecosystem without really using the word ecosystem.
Yeah, I think sometimes kind of models or methodologies and ecosystems sound strange and frightening to a simple class member company.
Yeah, I think it's sort of something I think larger companies, they find it interesting and they would like to be challenged in the way that they operate. I think maybe smaller, especially SMEs, they see it as being too theoretical. But larger companies, they sort of like that challenge that you may sort of give them discussing what could their role be.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, and Lou?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, this is from Lund University.
Oh, Camilla. Hello.
Actually, I have a question for Troels, if he's still here.
Yes, I'm still here.
I want to follow up on what Lucia asked you before. It's a question relating to scalability of new innovations. You talked about the advantages of combining solutions from different companies and then adapting that to an institution or a public buyer. What kind of challenges does that bring to scalability, and what is the role of the cluster in that process?
Well, I think the role that we would like to play in the future is, so for example, often what you do when you do matchmaking today, it's relatively opportunistic. You do it as part of your ongoing activities or within the framework of a project, where you say you may have a potential customer, a Danish municipality, with a specific need, and they try to go to us to be matched with a company with a particular solution, or the other way around. A company with a solution, they'd like to have it tested, proven the business case, and they ask, can we find somewhere, do we know the municipality or a hospital that's interested in such a collaboration? And I think what we should do as a cluster organization is to say, well, that's fine, but based on experience. So they end up in a collaboration, and then afterwards, they might even have a solution that works fine for the first municipality. And then they think, now we've proven the case for 1 out of 98 municipalities in Denmark, let's go to the other 97 and sell the same solution. And they're met with the question, well, actually, our needs are a little different. We would love to do another development project, and we would love to get the political support and PR we can get out of such a collaboration. Whereas the private company is saying, well, if we actually just spend a lot of hours developing one solution, we thought this would fit all the different municipalities. So our role as a cluster organization is to make sure that we have as linear a process as possible. So if it's the objective of a private company to develop a solution that you can use for all Danish municipalities to get the necessary scale, we try to invite more than one municipality and more than one supplier to say, okay, instead of having a one-on-one relationship, let's see how many different suppliers could offer a solution here, how many municipalities would be interested in the same, try to make joint specifications for the solution, try to have a collaboration on the testing, so that afterwards you can see there's a potential much larger market for your solution as a private company.
Yeah.
And at the same time, if you're talking about scale internationally, if you have a company that say, we're going to test this solution in one municipality in Denmark, and then we ask them, so do you plan on exporting this solution? And they say, yes, next step is Germany. Say, okay, are you aware of the requirements in order to document efficacy and safety in Germany? And if you are not, then we can guide you to somebody who are aware of it, and we can make sure that somebody else can help you fulfill those requirements. So while you do your first testing in Denmark, make sure that those results can also be used for a filing in Germany. So it's very much about drawing the map. Where does our member want to go? Where are they today? Where do they want to end up? And try to make that as a linear, as a streamlined process as possible, rather than a star where they go back and forth and back and forth. So that will cut down on costs and on time.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And then I think we have one final question from Tracy. One moment. Yeah, Tracy? Tracy, are you there?
Okay, apparently you can't hear me. My computer's saying I have poor audio quality.
We can hear you now.
You can hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I'll try. I have two questions, if I can. And it's about the internationalization of the welfare tech cluster. And it probably builds on what you were just discussing. And I wondered if you have private companies in your cluster that would like to be testing their new products and technologies on a much bigger market. Obviously we have hospitals all around the world. Is there anything stopping them from including other hospitals and health centers, into the network or into the cluster? I mean, do you have other health organizations from other countries as part of the cluster?
Truls, do you want to answer this one?
Yeah, I think the answer is not yet, but that's certainly, if you're asking to our internationalization strategy, what we should not do is take one company in the hand and then try to find a customer or collaboration in some given country, anywhere in the world where they might want to go. What we should do is say, are there clusters as good and as ambitious as ours within the same field in various countries that are the natural next step for a Danish company going abroad, and then establish a collaboration on a cluster-to-cluster basis, so that that cluster, for example, in Germany or in Sweden or in Australia or in England, will be the sort of the point of entry, where you can get your bearings right as a Danish company moving outside of Denmark. I think that's what we should focus on.
Mm-hmm.
And to a certain extent,
I mean, just a little bit of feedback as a cluster practitioner from the other side of the world. You guys there in Denmark are leading the way in this area from where we stand. So I suspect you already have a little bit of a brand that you could be marketing and attracting interest from big hospitals and health centers around the world. Participate and contribute to what you're doing. Anyway, that's just a comment from myself. Secondly, and this is
answer to that actually. So just this week we have one consultant from Welfare Tech in Brazil. It's far away. In order to explore the possibilities, are there any clusters, or are there anybody who wants to build a cluster like ours? Keeping in mind that Welfare Tech, we were a greenfield cluster 5 years ago, and there was nothing yet. So we also have experience in building it from scratch. So we can offer two things: collaborations with those already there, and even technical assistance to those who want to build it. The outcome of that so far 2-day visit to Brazil is that the leading hospital in South America, which is Albert Einstein in Sao Paulo, are actually coming on with a delegation to Denmark, to Welfare Tech, to look for potential providers of solutions to their needs within, in this case, intensive care, in about 3 weeks' time.
Yeah, this is exactly the sort of thing I was thinking. That you may be able to attract the interest of big health organizations around the world anyway, just because you're an early starter in this field and you've made, already making a name for yourselves. I don't believe there's others out there, other regions in the world doing this as well as you seem to be at the moment. But the other question, and far more practical question I had, is you mentioned the cluster membership fees. And it differentiates between the private sector and the public sector. My question is, do you charge the public sector a lot more or less because they're the customer at the end of the day? I'm just curious, which way is it?
I think the answer is not a lot more and not a lot less. It's actually pretty comparable. We pretty much looked at what are the number of employees, what's the budget of such an organization. whether it's the turnover in a company or it's the budget for a public institution, and then we said let's put the price on a comparable level. So no, it's not whether they are a buyer or a seller that makes a difference. I believe that the buyers have just as significant need for the services that our cluster members can offer as the sellers. Yes. So I don't think we should necessarily favor one towards the other. And I think having a price that's sufficiently high to actually make sure that only those who are really interested participate in a cluster. I mean, it's also a way of separating the wheat from the chaff in a way.
Yes, yes. So do you mind me, I mean, can I ask roughly average fee?
I think the average fee is around $2,000 US, probably a little less, and the median is about $3,000 US. And I think that's very cheap. I started here in April, and I think there's a potential for increasing it quite significantly. But I just want to make sure that we have a competitive catalog of services that we can offer our members before we increase the price. But I think for some members that price would be more like $50,000 US, and they would still be interested in membership.
Yeah. So yes, thank you. That's exactly what I was looking for. So, and I'll just say, I think perhaps next year we might send a delegation over your way too. We'll see how we go. Okay? Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Yeah. Okay. One final question?
I think we passed more or less way over 3 o'clock anyway. So I would just like to say thank you very much for your participation, and I hope really that that this can sort of provide some input to the way that you think about cluster development, and the way that you analyze them and work with them, because it has really been showing, giving some great results here, providing input to the cluster strategy and the sort of the whole process around it. So we certainly recommend it, and we hope that this webinar has given some impression on it. Great discussion today, great questions you had. Yeah, thank you very much for your time, and I can see that people are ticking in. Thank you, and we thank you for your time. So if we have another webinar, we will let you know. Thank you.
Bye.